TITT Talks supports the Department of Health and Human Services COVID-19 education campaign. We Can Do This efforts to increase education and awareness about COVID-19 vaccines. Whether due to language barriers or lack of access to healthcare, many Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders face unique challenges to getting accurate vaccine information. We hope that amplifying these resources, especially in other languages, will help reach and protect our most vulnerable communities. Please visit vaccines.gov for more information. Four BFFs who grew from friends to fierce boss moms.
Join us as we shoot from the tit as Asian American Pacific Islander women,
discovering modern hacks for both surviving and thriving in this ever-changing mama world.
Not quite TED Talks, but TITT Talks with your favorite girlfriends.
And welcome to a special edition of our podcast and a collaboration of insight, history, frustration, and hope featuring TITT Talks and Raising Compassionate Leaders, RCL. We have come together today in light of some horrific anti-Asian hate crimes to address why this could be happening and what we can do about it, along with some subject experts from the RCL board. This is such a dense topic that there is no way we can touch upon much of it, but this is the start of an ongoing discussion. We are so grateful for your leadership and partnership, and on behalf of the Tiffany's and Issa, we wanted to welcome Chris and Justine to the conversation. So could you please actually introduce yourselves and give us a little bit of insight as to why you're here with us today?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that. So my name is Justine. I've been working with Raising Compassionate Leaders since its inception. And, working with RCL has been such a wonderful experience and has allowed me to process both my own experiences and the experiences of other minorities. And being a part of such a diverse organization with two amazing Black women as co-founders has also helped me as a minority advocate for myself and for other minorities. And it's just really powerful to be part of such a diverse community. I'm also a PhD student at UCI, and my research interests are in the exploration and implementation of digital mental health tools for Asian communities. And I think that both my work at RCL and as a doctoral student have really allowed me to think about how we can leverage our resources and be a part of the solution when it comes to AAPI discrimination.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Justine. So Chris, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Of course. Okay. My name is Kristine Yi. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice in Pasadena, California. I'm also trained as a psychoanalyst. So that's my theoretical orientation. And I am a 1.5 generation Korean American, which means that I was born and raised in Korea and came here as a teenager. So, I'm bilingual and bicultural. My practice in Pasadena is majority Asian American female patients. So, in response to the Atlantic shooting, I had a explosive reaction from my Asian American female patients. So I thought that this would be a good forum for me to share some of their experiences.
Fantastic. And we're so glad that we have your expertise here with us today. So I will kick us off with the first question, really. And Chris, you really, what you experienced, that explosive outburst after the Atlanta shootings, is exactly what kind of compelled us to really get together today to really talk through why this is happening and kind of how we can handle this as the AAPI community, and also bring other communities to help support the cause too. So after the Atlanta shootings, and given factors like your age, generation, your own experiences, what is your perspective on tackling these issues surrounding the AAPI violence? And what do you feel has been the sentiment with the Asian community?
Well, for me personally, I am from Gen Z, and Gen Z is pretty well known for its digital literacy and ability to navigate the internet, navigating social media. And I have seen lately that we've been using the internet for information and social media as a way to kind of transfer information to each other, to educate, and to also find resources for our own selves and our own mental health. And with that, there's also a lot of distressing media coverage that has been prevalent throughout social media and throughout the internet in general. So I think that for my generation, we're also kind of traumatized in a way by the amount of violence that we constantly see. And, let's be honest, as Gen Z, it's super difficult to get off of social media. But every time we log onto social media, there's something else that's happening. And I think that affects my perspective in terms of tackling these issues. And I think that, looking at social media and looking at the internet and how we can leverage those resources for good are something that I'm still working on. And I think Gen Z is working on as a whole. So yeah, I definitely think that my generation has an interesting perspective when it comes to AAPI violence and connecting with older generations. And I think that the sentiment within the Gen Z Asian community is a lot of pushing back on the model minority myth and, learning and educating through social media.
So that is an awesome perspective from Gen Z. So Tilo and Issa, I wanted to throw it over to you. I don't think we're quite Gen Z, but we are upper millennials, I would say. So what has your perspective been? Because we've talked about this a lot on our own group chats. And both of your insights have been just really incredible as to how you're feeling about this.
Tilo, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's the same. Obviously, we're millennials and we are plugged in. So I myself, from a personal perspective, have had a difficult time managing it because, to your point, Justine, it is traumatic. Like every time I look at my phone and I look at Instagram, it's difficult because I think we're more interconnected to that sub-Asian culture than the general, the mainstream news is actually showing us. So if you're looking at Neck Shark, you're looking at Very Asian Co., you're looking at Jackfruit, any of those Instagram accounts are solely giving us Asian hate content, which is very difficult because I feel like we're being confronted by it every day. And I think I personally am just trying to manage my own self-care in terms of like being able to just shut it off or, just scroll past it, because I know that I cannot take, one more input of that type of information right now. Maybe I can later, but it's more so of like, how do I manage my own feelings and being connected to how I'm feeling so that I can be able to manage what I can handle on a daily basis.
Right. And to piggyback off of that, I think being millennials, we're kind of caught in the in-between between, the older generation, us, and then Gen Z. So we grew up kind of with that model minority myth in our heads, or to pursue a 4-year degree and not necessarily be more creative or do other things, and playing into that model minority myth as well. So I think we have kind of like both sides where I'll speak for myself. In college, I wasn't really exploring, what it meant to be a minority, what it meant to be, I'm Pacific Islander, what it meant to be Chamorro and Japanese as well. And really, I don't know if you know this, but we rushed a historically white sorority. So, kind of unpacking those things now is also part of the millennial experience, I feel like, where I feel like Gen Z really knows who they are, really tied to, their culture and being proud of it, where I was raised to, primarily speak English in public spaces and things like that. So I think, Gen Z has a little more leverage in being themselves, and we were taught to fit this mold, in the millennial space that we are in. I know my younger brother's a millennial too, but he kind of relates more to Gen Z. So I think that's a little of the dynamics that we're also experiencing, or I experience as a millennial.
I think that the model minority myth is something that all of us, every generation of Asian American, has been struggling with. And I think one of the psychological effects of the model minority myth is that it has, I think, erased our racialized experience as Asian Americans. So we have become quasi-white or white adjacent. So I think the effect of that is that we are blind to, again, our racialized experience. We cannot always recognize, because we were similar to whites. We, fit nicely into white spaces. When we are subjected to, let's say, microaggression or racism, it is harder for us to recognize because of that model minority myth and identity. We've internalized that. We see ourselves similar to whites. We don't see color, right? So I think it has had negative impact on us that way.
Yeah, and I think sort of also coming to terms with how entrenched that is in our everyday lives has really been a light bulb moment for me myself. To your point, there is a proximity, to that whiteness that we benefit from. However, I think in this last year, I think it's highlighted just how much this white supremacist culture actually doesn't benefit anybody except white people. All people of color are really struggling under this structure that we have in America. And, I think about the Black Americans in this country that have been subject to this for longer than we have. And it's disheartening, I think, for me, because I'm like, wow, we're, hundreds of years into this struggle. And, in our lifetime, how much change is really going to happen? And that's really something that I've been struggling with personally. And I know there's been progress. There definitely has. But I mean, every day, I just feel like still people are fighting for basic human rights. And it's a really hard pill for me to swallow. And that's been something I've been struggling with for the past few months.
I think this has been a moment of reckoning for Asian Americans because the model minority contract has been exposed as a sham, and all the pernicious, insidious stereotypes about Asian Americans, I think, coming to the foreground. And, we're right back to being yellow peril, teeming horde of diseased people posing existential threats to white America, right? And I think scale has come off of a lot of people's eyes. What I see in terms of speaking about the generational difference, the group of Asian Americans that has probably hardest time seeing racism in American society for what it is the immigrant generation, because they have to carry the illusion of equality and justice and opportunity for success in America, right? That American dream has to live on for them. I mean, otherwise, why are they here? And to really see racism in America for what it is, I mean, it's an assault to their sense of reality, right? I think for that generation, it's a little harder to see and come to terms with that. I think the younger generation is able to see that more clearly, right? And the generational gap and the conflict that comes out of that, I think is, I'm sure, something that a lot of, younger generation is dealing with at the moment. It's hard because, the older generation, the immigrant population, parents are going to say, just study. They're going to be their tiger parent selves and push that, put your head down and study, do your thing, work hard. That narrative has a limitation.
And do you think that generation of people actually identify themselves as American, or do they just see themselves as immigrants? Whereas like we've been born here, we have that natural right as citizens, but the people that actually came here and immigrated here, do you think they see themselves as other?
Most definitely. I think that for immigrant generation, they see themselves as Asians, not Asian Americans.
Yeah.
And that was the case for me for a very long time as well, as an immigrant to this country. And I have experienced an interesting evolution in my own racial identity. To give you a very compelling example, when the psychological literature on microaggression came out by Daryl Sue, who is a Asian American psychologist, and that phrase, "Where are you from?" being the example of microaggression, it was hard for me to appreciate that because as a Asian, not Asian American, not having born in this country, that question was not offensive to me, if you know what I mean.
I do want to touch upon that generation gap and kind of like the differences in how we handle it just for a second. For our family members that may have a generation gap, how can we unpack the emotional trauma around being a member of the AAPI community in the US? And how can we even begin a conversation around AAPI stigma and discrimination with our family?
I think this is a really interesting question that I would like to tackle as an Asian American daughter. And I think that with my family members and what I see from my friends that are also Asian American is that this conversation is difficult to even begin with our family members. It can be really difficult to kind of come over that generation gap and to even discuss these really distressing topics. I think that for me personally, I have used media and have used things like movies to even begin a conversation with my family because, and I'm not sure if this is true for all of you, but in a lot of people that are in Asian cultures, there's a very clear boundary of respect when it comes to talking to your family members, specifically your older family members, and, you know, filial piety and this idea of respect towards your elders. So when you talk about, you know, differences of opinion, or you're trying to teach them something, it becomes increasingly difficult because it's something that they don't really want to face because it is really distressing. And it's also an issue of respect, right? Whenever I talk to my parents, at least, about my opinions, you know, you're always kind of taught to keep your head down. And when you're talking to older family members, to not argue. And so beginning that conversation has been really difficult for me and for other people that I know as well in the AAPI community. And so I think that for me personally, I've been using media to begin this conversation. So I'll say like, hey, do you want to watch this movie or this documentary? And then from that documentary, you know, it provides a non-confrontational way to present information to my family members. So yeah, that's what I have been doing lately.
You know, it's such a tough subject, as I have several patients who, of course, were, you know, struggling with their experiences of racism, you know, sexual objectification. That has come up so much in response to the Atlanta shooting. You know, so many of my patients sharing their experiences around being objectified and sexualized at the hands of white men. And you know, it was interesting phenomenon for me, even for me as someone that's tuned into Asian American experience, to have so many of those experiences come up. In fact, for some people for the first time in therapy was quite eye-opening for me. So for many, to bring up those experiences with family members, especially parents, is extremely difficult thing to do. Of course, some try, but I would say that conversations are not always easy. And I think the thing to do is to know that these are difficult conversations to have in Asian American family, especially with your elders, and take care to not to put the blame on yourself and turn to others that you could, you know, talk to and process your feelings or support.
Definitely. And I do think as well that it's important to also acknowledge how older or, you know, your parents and your family members, how they might process the anti-Asian hate in ways that may be potentially unhealthy, and being able to identify that. So, you know, you see some people that transform this anti-AAPI racism into other forms of racism, or even, you know, deflecting and saying that that will never happen to me. And I think that, let's say, I think that we talked about this before, Chris, where some of your patients didn't see themselves as well in the Atlanta shootings and would deflect the conversation. And so I think that, you know, being able to identify these unhealthy coping mechanisms and being able to kind of process and talk about that is also really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Basically, you know, I had bifurcation in people's response to the Atlantic shooting. Some of the patients felt deep identification with the shooting victims, although they were different in their educational assimilation, career, you know, status. They felt identified because they themselves have gone through experiences of being objectified and so on. While others drew very strong boundary between themselves and the shooting victims, and almost putting the blame on the victims, saying, they were, they put themselves in vulnerable position, right? So I think that kind of defense is a way to protect yourself and give yourself an illusion of safety and personal control, right? But of course, what makes you vulnerable to racist attacks is your skin color and gender, that you have no personal control over. So that's one thing. And I think also the putting the blame on the victim, that prevents you from seeing systemic racism. That's really the cause of the problem.
Tilo, I think you had a comment earlier.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off what Justine said. And I think just the education and utilizing that as a platform to start the conversation has been so helpful. I think right after the Atlanta shootings happened, PBS made the Asian American History series available for free streaming. And it's like a 5-series documentary about the history of Asian Americans. And if I would recommend that to anybody listening, know your history and know where you came from, because that helps inform everything that is happening now and the history of our oppression in the United States.
I have to say that that's helped me, I guess, kind of acknowledge the hate, not accept it at all, but just understand more of where it's stemming from and the history behind it and how long, because, I think with the older generation, you talk about these things and they're like, well, this has been happening for generations and it's true. And so for them, it may not necessarily be a new thing, even though there's a, stark uptick in the occurrences of AAPI hate. But I think it helps acknowledge also where they're coming from and what they've dealt with in the past, with laws that restricted their business or them being here, or immigration itself. And I come from a different background where I come from a colonized island, a territory of the United States, where people still don't have some of the freedoms that they should have, like being able to vote for the government or having a congressman in the government that can't vote. So, I come from a different place, but I think learning the history of that has really helped me in processing my feelings, I think.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think understanding our history and having conversations with each other, I think help us to have a collective narrative. Hopefully that speaks to our experience, but that also emphasize hopefully our resilience as well. The narrative that we can all have a sense of belonging. And hopefully it would be a narrative that just doesn't critique the mainstream culture, but something that we could also take apart and have a stake in, towards a more diverse society, inclusive society.
Let's talk about our children for a little bit. How do we even start the conversation with our children about what's happening? And how do we protect the mental health of our children in such unsettling times?
I think that, providing warmth and acceptance and things like microprotections and affirmations are especially important, and knowing that your kids and your teens are going through a really tough time as well. I think also, preparing them for biases that they might see and how to approach those can also be helpful. And in terms of your question regarding mental health, I think that it starts with really just destigmatizing that and, validating their input and their feelings and, letting them know that they're part of the solution, not the problem. And there are a lot of things that go into that. But I think that also, just being open to your own experiences and connecting with your child and your teen on that level as a daughter, for me, would be incredibly helpful. I think that seeing vulnerability in your parents and, advocating and organizing with each other and being or standing in solidarity with them is incredibly helpful. And, there's this reciprocal value as well to helping with nonprofit organizations or like working with other people in the AAPI community, where as you help other people, it also helps yourself and helps you process your own feelings. And connecting with other people, part of the AAPI community, can be incredibly helpful. And in addition, I do think that it's important for kids and teens to also have resources where they see Asian characters or Asian portrayals of strength rather than of victimization, which I think they've been seeing a lot lately. And that has affected their own self-confidence as well. So I think that, being able to really see these strong people that are of Asian descent is helpful in their own confidence, is helpful for their mental health. And on RCL's website, we also have a large range of resources available, books and media, and there are plenty of other places where you can leverage your resources and really make that available to your kids. And so I think that as a daughter and as someone that is also doing research in digital mental health, this is something that is incredibly helpful, especially in the era of digital media and the internet.
Well, yeah, I think that those are really excellent points, Justine. And I'd like to add parent perspective. And that is, being a mom to two teens, I could share some of my personal experiences as well. And it's very stressful for us to experience and witness racial trauma. And I personally find it distressing to have to talk to my children about them. I know I have to because it's important, right? But to do so isn't always easy. I do have to be in the right frame of mind and give myself a chance to collect my own thoughts, take a couple of deep breaths, So set the stage and collect my thoughts too, and then enter into a conversation, because it isn't easy. Yeah. Just to highlight a couple of points you made, Justine. One is asking your child how they're feeling and thinking. What's their reaction about what happened? It is so important to validate their experience and feelings, and it could go such a long way. It's like a magic, really. Parent validating a child's feelings. It does enormous good. One thing. And the other piece you mentioned about sharing parents' experience, I think that's also helpful. Obviously, you want to be age appropriate. You don't want to overwhelm your child with your own, experience of trauma. So use your judgment. But what I have found is that when I share with them what I have gone through, they listen to it with relish. And I think it's because they feel as if you understand their experience because you have gone through it and you have made it through, from their perspective, a parent that they respect has gone through the same experience. I think it just normalizes their experience and gives them energy that they too can somehow work through it themselves. Yeah, and that sense of kind of coming together and shared experience, I think, is really powerful.
I completely agree with that because even as an adult, I gained so much by learning about my parents and my grandparents' experiences. And so I can only imagine as a teenager, if that was shared with me more, how much more pride I would have and more protection over myself, that I would display. Because honestly, I have a 2-year-old and recently we went out and I couldn't believe that these small microaggressions starts that early. There was a woman who said, "I want a little Asian baby." And that just felt odd. I can't express, I guess, like in a scientific way, what is wrong with that, but it just felt so off. And even her friend had to tell her, "You can't say that." But also, other people following us around saying she's like so cute. I want to set her up with my grandson, and they are not my race themselves. So it starts super early. So I think, sharing our experiences, sharing my experience, I will definitely do that with my daughter because there's something like that was never taught to me. And I'm sure my mom experienced. And I just had to fend it off myself, either laughing nervously or, there's a lot of stigmas that go along with being an Asian woman, being exoticized. I don't know if that's a word, but, and I didn't understand that it started so early. So I agree that learning and sharing will definitely be part of my parenting with my daughter as, I move on. she gets older.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that it's also, understanding that, like you had said, kids learn these things from a very young age. And I think that parents are hesitant to have these conversations with their children because they assume that they don't understand. And that's simply not the case. And as someone that was not a teenager too long ago, I think that it is definitely helpful for my parents to know that I am mature enough to understand these conversations, and that I'm old enough to do so, and that, I have had to learn what it means to be an Asian American ever since I could learn how to speak. So it definitely is also understanding that your child can handle these tough conversations with you and just approaching that head on.
Yeah. And the point that you also touched upon is, if it has to really to do with a positive stereotyping. Asians are cute, they're exotic, they're this or that. They're positive stereotypes. It's hard to call it out because it is positive. You're supposed to graciously accept it, but it's problematic to the degree that it really doesn't speak to your who you are. Right? You as a person, it puts you in a category instead of seeing you as a whole person. So I would say that is the issue, these positive stereotypes.
I agree. Yeah, it was hard to express that it felt uncomfortable to me because I did get some people to say, hey, she's cute, but it felt odd. Yeah.
So Justine, I know you have some resources for us and our listeners if they're interested in learning more and really taking action. Do you want to run through that list with us?
Sure. Well, first thing that I do want to say is that, encouraging leadership and activism also starts with, leading with example and encouraging children to advocate alongside you. And lets them foster these leadership skills really early on, and asking them questions like, well, how did this activism make you feel, and capitalizing when it makes them feel good, and saying that, see, like, if you work with this organization, or if you do this good deed, it makes you feel good and makes you feel better about the situation. And so one example that I like to give is writing a letter to Congress about something that you are distressed about, like AAPI violence. And even if your child can't write necessarily, they can be alongside you in that. They can help you drop it off at the mailbox. They can help you put the stamp on it. There are tons of little things that they can do. And so I think that leading with example is also really important. The first resource I will talk about is rcleaders.com, which is the organization that I've been working with since its inception. And I've been so proud to be able, as an Asian American woman, to provide a bunch of resources for parents and for parents, educators, and also for organizations, for family members. So there are a lot of different resources that are on there, including media, books, things like that. We also host a ton of events and even book readings. We recently had a book reading of Luna's Yum Yum Dim Sum, which is excellent for Asian American children. So we definitely have a lot of resources there. And then I think that there are also a ton of resources that are available in terms of taking care of your own mental health. And if you see an act of discrimination or of violence, I'd highly recommend going to 844-9-NO-HATE.org or calling 1-844-9-NO-HATE. And then there are also resources for mental health support, specifically Care for Coronavirus Anxiety, which was implemented by this digital tool called the Shine app, and then Asian Mental Health Collective. And there are a couple of organizations that are also out there for DACA recipients. So yeah, definitely a lot is out there. And then there are also basic needs resources like Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum, which has resources that are translated in different languages. There's also labor alliances and coronavirus resource kits. So there's definitely a lot that is out there. And I think that it's especially important to highlight these for those that might not be as digitally literate and may not be as inclined to, go on the internet, especially for older generations. And I think that starting these conversations around AAPI violence, a lot of it can be understanding that, your family members may not want to talk about it, but just giving them these resources so that they can approach this on their own terms.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Justine. And just to reiterate, we are really just scratching the surface in terms of starting the conversation about AAPI hate and violence. And we hope to be part of this ongoing conversation on how to help navigate the very, very complex waters of this and really all hate in general. So thank you so much for being a part of this powerful conversation with us. At TITT Talks and RCL, we seek to understand and improve the lives of those like and unlike us. And to hear more, follow us on Instagram at tit_talks or email us at tittalks@gmail.com. We always love hearing from you, and we hope that you'll join us again soon. Thank you all so much for tuning in.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Justine and Chris.